Hey all, here OS Reviews. In this video, we're taking a retro revisited look back at the Olympus Tough TG-1. This is a rugged point-and-shoot style digital camera. This is a series of digicams that some of you guys actually brought to my attention a couple of months back. And it's quite interesting because it looks like Olympus, now known as OM Systems, refreshes this line on a pretty regular basis, with the last one coming out just last year, a couple of months back, called the TG-7 or the 7th generation. That also makes the TG line one of the longest running digital camera series that I've seen. Again, over 15 years it's been in production with incremental upgrades, which is actually quite impressive. And also shows that the first gen model I think was very forward thinking for its time. Now granted, it's still a digicam, so we'll take a closer look at some of the specs later, but it doesn't have the largest sensor. However, it does have some notable features here which I still think are kind of interesting. For example, it comes with this removable lens ring that you can pop off and then attach other accessories, turning it into a fisheye effect, ultra wide angle lens, even a telephoto optical zoom lens, other UV filters. So it's kind of taking a page from certain DSLR interchangeable lens cameras. Of course, the actual glass and the sensor are not really being swapped out in this case, but still I guess better than nothing. And also this particular series has two flashes, one which is a brighter xenon flash, giving you enhanced reach in the dark. However, if you're trying to capture close-up shots, you don't want everything to blow out because it's too bright. You can use the LED flash instead, so you get both of those options built in. And all of this was coupled with a rather bright f2.0 aperture for a compact digicam, that is, letting in sufficient light that is going to be relatively bright, even if you are shooting in slightly darker environments. Although the sensor size underneath is still a pretty typical 1/2.3 inch type that's found in pretty much all of the point-and-shoot style digital cameras that are in this consumer class. And that is actually one aspect, the sensor size as well as the aperture, which hasn't changed even 7 generations later. They're still using the same 1/2.3 inch type sensor, which means that the overall picture quality isn't going to be dramatically different across the generations. It's just that in the newer models, you now have the ability to record 4K videos, whereas the original model here was stuck at 1080p full HD resolution. But if you're using it mainly as a still camera for taking photos, I guess it doesn't matter all that much, since the components are still quite similar. And in terms of pricing, that might be another reason to consider a slightly previous gen model like this, because you can find the TG-1, if you're shopping around, often for just around $60, under $100. So it is going to be a pretty significant cost saving compared to the newest revision models, actually selling north of $600, which in my opinion is just too pricey for specs, which are honestly quite similar unless you must have 4K video recording. But still, I think that's kind of a hard sell when the previous models can be found for just a fraction of the cost. And it's just pretty cool to be using an OG model that has withstood the test of time. Now, as a rugged camera, this one is built to withstand waterproof rating up to 12 meters or 40 feet of submersion, in addition to being 2 meters or 6.6 feet shockproof and crushproof. So if you're going hiking, taking this through the wilderness, you can be a little bit more rough with it and even capture underwater photos of fish, for example, if you're going diving or swimming, and it will still survive. The waterproof rating here also means that the entire lens is hidden underneath this piece of glass, including the 4x optical zoom. It's similar to a camcorder in that it doesn't actually move out, unlike many other digicams on the market. So here's an example as we zoom in and out. You can see the lens there actually start to move a little bit further in and out, but it actually doesn't change the kind of surface from the camera, continuing to remain flush, so no dust or water can seep in. Versus, again, most regular point-and-shoot style digicams, the lens is going to retract like so, but as a result, it might be more fragile. If dust gets into the compartments, it's going to suck in, harder to clean, and eventually result in some spots on the sensor, which is going to be a little more frustrating, which is a con when it comes to longer term durability versus everything here being weather sealed. The battery door and SD card compartment also has 2 locks just for added security, making it harder for any dust or water to seep in. Final look here at the design, we do have a pretty nice grip that makes it comfortable to hold when you're shooting with the camera, and it still remains relatively compact, of course, versus a modern day smartphone. It's going to fit pretty easily into a pocket, backpack when you are traveling. It is a point-and-shoot style digicam at the end of the day, so it's a decent choice as a kind of everyday carry, for example, with nice ergonomics. And also on the side here is going to be the the built-in kind of lanyard. It is a red design strap by default on the first gen model, but obviously you can replace it, reinforced here with metal. On the very top, you'll also find access to the GPS antenna, because yes, this thing does have geotagging capabilities as well. And it does include left and right stereo microphones for audio pickup as well, with some ambient noise reduction using the software, which is actually not shabby, although there is no external mic input. This is further flanked by a power key as well as a 2-stage camera shutter key for focus and then all the way down to snap a shot. The back here then features the zoom controls, which is a little bit different compared to having a zoom dial usually built into the shutter button of most digicams, but this I guess is just to enhance the water resistance rating of the camera. The back here also features a dedicated button here for video recording, playback, as well as 4-way navigation toggle, and some mode selection dials, and also 2 custom switches. For example, if you have a favorite scene effect or filter, you can save it into these customizable positions, allowing you to jump into those settings more quickly on the fly. Back of the camera here also houses a 3-inch OLED display on the first and second generation models, but on the third generation all the way up to the current 7th gen, it has been replaced by an IPS LCD screen instead. OLED screen of the first 2 models actually had a little bit better contrast. Colors were super vibrant and punchy, even though perhaps in terms of durability, an IPS LCD screen might be a little more beneficial there. Original gen model here came with 12 megapixels for that sensor. Now on the other side, there's also another door, again with 2 locks in place that you can access the HDMI port as well as the kind of USB port for transferring images out. Now the boot up time I think is also relatively quick, turning on with just a snap here within just a second or so. And something I do find to be a little bit interesting about the TG series is it has a electronic compass and barometer functionality as well, even when the camera is turned off, just by tapping on the up key of the 4-way navigation toggle, jumping into a simplified UI that just tells you the compass for direction, the altitude, barometer, as well as the time and date information, which is synced automatically using the GPS satellite reception. So you don't have to ever manually type in the date and time because it's just synced using the wireless connectivity, which is actually pretty helpful. So you can see this kind of visualization in real time, actually quite helpful, again, if you are going into the wilderness. Now jumping into the kind of interface here, it's relatively simple to operate. Again, all these zoom controls here are pretty easy to use. It is continuous zoom, of course, so during the entire range, it's going to remain nice and sharp. And along with the digital magnification, you can get up to 8 times closer to your subjects. However, that will degrade the image quality. 4 times is going to be the sharpest. Overall autofocus speed is actually not bad, especially considering the age of this particular camera. You can see in the auto mode, the recommended aperture on the very bottom there is also going to be displayed. Now, if we jump into some more of the menu options, you can also enable flash settings, including a red eye reduction mode, in addition to some self-timer modes, resolution modes for changing it higher or lower. And under more advanced settings, you can change the optical image stabilization, OIS. And the first gen and second gen models did not come with built-in Wi-Fi capability, which was technically added in some of the later models, that you could directly transfer images over to a smartphone app or computer without connecting any cables. However, this one did support iFi Wi-Fi SD cards as another option if you wanted to pick up that accessory. Also allows you to turn on some of the other sensors here, including the barometer for air pressure, atmospheric pressure, units of measurement between meters and feet can also be changed. Power consumption was generally not an issue, at least in my experience, just because it is using still a relatively small sensor size, mostly lasting through a full day's outing without too many complaints. I'm also glad to see that when the camera switches back and forth between the playback as well as the shooting modes, it remembers the magnification amount of the lens. So for example, we were at 4 times zoom previously, and when we switched back, it was still at the same amount. So it's not going to automatically trigger back into 1 times, for example. Now, if we tap on some of the other options, including info, you can also switch into a grid composition and also a histogram view for some slightly more advanced controls, or hiding everything from view altogether. And then going through some of those other aforementioned modes, there's one dedicated for low light images, which will actually slightly increase the exposure time to collect a little bit more light information, but you have to hold relatively still. And what's surprising is even on this first gen model, there was already HDR capabilities built into this camera, or high dynamic range, snapping more than one image and applying some computational photography techniques to brighten up some of the shadow regions. However, because of the more limited processing power on an older camera like this, you did have to wait a little bit longer for your shots to complete rendering if you had HDR turned on. You can also find a sports mode that prioritizes capturing an image quickly, and now going into the scene selection mode, You can see the aforementioned HDR that we mentioned there earlier by combining multiple shots together to brighten things up. There's even a 3D capture mode, although there's only one lens on here, so you have to kind of pan and tilt the camera around, slightly changing the perspective to then capture the image. An ultra-wide panoramic shot, snow shots, pet modes can also be found. And because of the slightly smaller sensor, this camera actually has very good macro capability, allowing you to focus up to just 1 centimeter away from the lens. It can be almost pressing right against the glass and still get in focus, which is quite impressive. So it does do pretty well there. You can even capture some different shots specifically for underwater, improving the colors, vibrancy, and a couple of other modes here include one for document scanning. With a built-in microphone, it can record a 4-second snippet with a still image as well. Kind of an interesting idea there. Dedicated one for food as well as fireworks, again slightly changing some of the colors accordingly based on these different modes. So surprisingly, the software here is pretty fully featured, I have to say, considering that this camera is now over 15 years old, which is just insane. Time really does fly, but again, just shows how forward-thinking this original model was, considering that the latest models are still having a pretty similar sensor size, all things considered. Now, those are all the scene effects. You can also jump into the magic mode, which are going to be the filter effects. So specifically, we have a fisheye kind of effect that you can play around with directly. This is of course simulated using software, so it's going to apply some vignetting on the outside corners and apply kind of a basically photo frame effect on top of your photos if you don't want to do some additional editing and post. There's also a dramatic shot effect, fragmented, more artistic effect, including a miniature effect, reflection, watercolor, sparkle are all some examples that you can find on here, further playing around and having a little bit more fun. That being said, one mode that isn't found in the built-in filters would be a monochrome or dynamic black and white mode, which is a little bit of a shame. In fact, I think that would have been the most practical filter, since many people like to take black and white images, creating more of a moody appearance. Instead, they went with some of these more playful options instead. That said, the black and white mode was introduced on later revisions of the TG line. So if that is a mode you're looking for, it might be a reason to consider a slightly newer model in the series. Similarly, some of the newer models also gain full manual control, the ability for you to adjust properties like even the aperture as well as the focus distance, whereas on the TG-1 and TG-2, it was still more of a point-and-shoot experience. Sure, it gave you some selectable options for things like super macro, on or off. However, if you're looking for pro-grade manual control, it wasn't quite available on this first-generation model. Similarly, all the images that you're taking are going to be captured in regular JPEG instead of having raw capture capability that can allow you to more easily edit those files in Photoshop and other photo editing applications later on. So raw capture support was one of the other incremental upgrades that was introduced, I believe around TG4 and above models having that. And now briefly looking at some sample images, I have to say that the overall picture quality has actually slightly exceeded my expectations, to be completely honest, looking at the age of the camera as well as the relatively small sensor size. However, as shown in some of these images, I was rather impressed with the colors looking quite vibrant and punchy, surprisingly, for a digicam of its time. So I think out of the waterproof line of cameras that are available, the TG line from Olympus, now known as OM Systems after their rebranding, I think has actually been one of the more consistent and better performing waterproof, durable cameras you can find. Actually, again, quite easy to use, quick to snap, with the super macro capabilities also coming in handy for getting up close and having just a little bit more of bokeh when you're capturing flowers, kind of reminding me of some of the early Google Pixel phones also being able to work a bit more magic in, considering their smaller sensors, just by using computational photography techniques like the aforementioned HDR here to boost the contrast and dynamic range. So looking back, I think the TG-1 here was also quite forward-thinking in that regard. Here's a few other examples of super macro. Overall colors are also quite natural and pretty consistent even on whites and reds, which tend to be more challenging for older cameras. Now here's an example of a shot that was captured without HDR, and here's the exact same shot with HDR turned on. So you can see a pretty dramatic difference there in brightening up the shot and preserving a bit more detail. You even get some kind of natural looking lens flare on some of these images here. Out of models with a 1/2.3" type standard sensor size, I have to say that the TG line has surprisingly exceeded my expectations. It's one of the better performing series I've seen that actually delivers results which are a little bit better than the specs should suggest, as you can tell here. Very vibrant and having some of those extra features like the added weather resistance, making it easy enough to take with you when you're, again, traveling, being a little bit more rough with the camera. Now, with that being said, of course, advances in smartphone photography has improved by leaps and bounds since 2012, where something like this would have been absolutely better than what was found on the majority of smartphones for its time. But that's no longer quite as true here in 2025. In fact, many flagship-grade smartphones have larger sensors, even more advanced and sophisticated computational photography. So whether it still makes sense to seek out an older model like this, I think just depends on if you want a little bit of that added optical zoom built on in, whether you want a kind of backup camera that is going to be more weatherproof, that you can just throw around, not really worry about it breaking. Could still be a couple of reasons to consider something like this, plus the dual flash capabilities, xenon flash, and that super macro capability could still make sense if the price is right, just as kind of a backup camera to take with you. You can also use it again for underwater photography. Here's a couple examples I found from a few other reviews for the time, just giving you a better idea. Colors again looking surprisingly vibrant straight out of the camera as JPEGs already. So the image processing here is really not shabby for a digicam. So there we have it. That is more or less it as far as a revisited look back at the Olympus TUF TG-1, the first generation model out of this very long-lasting and long-standing line of digicams that has outlasted the majority of other consumer tech series, whether it's other cameras or even certain smartphone lines. It's kind of rare to see one that has gone on for so long, aside from the iconic ones like iPhones, for example, and Samsung Galaxy S's of the world. But in comparison, the Olympus TG line, I have to say, is a bit more quiet and kind of understated. But yeah, my stereotype coming in was that the smaller sensor size, as well as the fact that it's a tough camera, probably more of the cost is going into the body and construction, kind of like having a case over it, for some reason made it a model that I just kind of ignored for a really long time. But actually checking out one of these earlier generation models, it's impressive how well it's held up from the perspective of image quality for a small point-and-shoot style camera. Actually can still be an excellent everyday carry type system, and again, an excellent value, I suppose, if you are comparing it with some of the newer models in the series. I think it's still a reasonable compromise for essentially a tenth of the price of the newest revision models. So if you're interested, you can check out more details in the links down below, but for now, that's been our video. Thanks for watching here at OS Reviews. That's been a look back at the Olympus TUF, that has been the TG-1